Hey, everybody, I thought it was appropriate to present this in the middle of two NFL divisional playoff contests. You probably watched an exhilarating game between the visiting Cincinnati Bengals and the host Tennessee Titans that the Bengals won shockingly last second field goal 19-16. Now we're gearing up for the San Francisco 49ers visiting the Green Bay Packers in Titletown, right? But this is a perfect time for me to take a little bit of time to talk to you about some very important stadium legislation that's coming down the pipe for fans of the Washington football team, soon to be renamed on February 2nd, but that's not what this is about. What was presented at Oakland News Now, and I'm asking you to really read in detail when you have the opportunity to do so, and presents here, okay, is Albert says his Titans were his top choice. Hey, heck of an outcome, huh? But I digress. Really want you to take time to read this when you have an opportunity. But this is sort of the Cliff Notes version of this post that is entitled "On Virginia Football Stadium Authority for a New Washington Football Team Stadium." And so you would say, okay, what's this all about? Well, as you know from the model there, that doesn't really apply anymore because they have a new design, which I'm trying to find the image for. The Washington football team needs a new stadium. And so there are two legislators that are working to form the organizational backbone that will allow Virginia essentially to float a bond issue to provide a subsidy that would go to the team. Now, I'm not here to argue the political merits of subsidies. This is reality. And basically, you have two senators, one Democrat, one Republican. You have Republican Senator Barry Knight, and you have Democratic Senator Richard Saslaw. Now, when I say senator, I mean state senator. I don't mean senator in Congress. No, that's not how this works, okay? Both of them have put together two items of legislation that the Washington Post erroneously called vastly different. They're not vastly different. I believe the person who did this was quoting someone, but these pieces of legislation are not vastly different. They both do one thing. They form something called the Virginia Football Stadium Authority, okay? And basically what they're doing is very much in their way, just like what the Raiders, Mark Davis, and the late Sheldon Adelson, rest in peace, of Las Vegas Sands did for Las Vegas and Nevada. They created, really through Nevada Governor Brian Sandoval and the Southern Nevada Tourism Infrastructure Committee, something called as it's named, the Las Vegas Stadium Authority. I hesitated because I had another name prior to that. It was Clark County, but it is called the Las Vegas Stadium Authority. And all the Stadium Authority does is basically what the Virginia Football Stadium Authority will do. The Virginia Football Stadium Authority will own the stadium, okay? And then what it will do contractually is let the Washington football team have the right of managing the stadium. And the money gained from that is substantial because it means that if you're the Rolling Stones or if you're Dr. Dre or any of the popular groups of today and you want to play in Washington at that gigantic stadium, which will be domed, all right, what you have to do is work with the Washington football team through AEG, which they would hire, or some competitor to AEG and Schutz Entertainment Group, which would manage the stadium on a daily basis, right? But that's a huge chunk of revenue for the Washington football team, just as it's provided a huge chunk of revenue for the Las Vegas Raiders, something the Raiders did not have in Oakland. In Oakland, by comparison, they didn't own the Raiders. Not only did not own the stadium, they didn't own the revenue stream. In other words, if you were going to be the Rolling Stones and you're going to play at the Coliseum in Oakland, you had to go through the Joint Powers Authority directly and its executive director and AEG and deal with them, or prior to that, SMG, Spectacor Management Group, right? This is different. So the key for the team's perspective is the ability to have a revenue stream that now former NFL head of NFL properties, Eric Grubman, described to me as like owning a stadium. What I mean by that is this. At the fall NFL owners meeting that was held in Charlotte, actually in Houston, excuse me, I asked Eric, I said, Eric, I thought Mark Davis wanted the Raiders to own the stadium. This was back in 2016. And he said, well, what if I own the revenue stream? Isn't that the same thing? Okay. And so there you go. That's the idea. The revenue stream is what comes from events, contracting to perform and produce their activities at the Washington football team's new stadium. Okay. That's the idea. Now, the other idea, of course, is we would say, Zinni, isn't this the idea is to get a subsidy? Yes, that is also another idea. Now, this is where I have some issues with how the legislation is structured right now. First of all, it basically says, hey, look, we're going to collect sales taxes from the facility that's developed, said to be a mixed-use facility around the stadium. Now, here is the problem. Sales taxes, from my experience at calculating sales tax revenue for use in a bond issue for stadiums, doesn't throw off as large a revenue stream as, say, property tax revenues. It's also more sales tax revenues to economic fluctuation. You know, you get less of it during a down year or recession. You get more of it during an up year when it's a boom cycle, right? Well, the property tax revenues, the way they're structured, that tends not to be the case. And so the property tax revenue tends to be very robust during economic upturns and downturns. So really, you want to use property tax revenue, what they call in the Virginia parlance, a real estate tax, okay? Same as a property tax, but they're not using that. And the other problem, as I see it, is that the real money from Virginia's perspective really would come if the Washington football team owned the stadium and a private activity bond was structured. You would say, what's that? Well, look, we all agree that Virginia is establishing a subsidy for the Washington football team, right? Okay. That is a private activity bond. In other words, that is a public activity for a private purpose. The private comes in the fact that the football organization is not owned by the state of Virginia. Okay. It is owned by Daniel Snyder and his group of investors, right? So what should be done is they should structure a private activity bond so that they would establish a separate authority, the Virginia Football Stadium Authority, which would govern the collection of the property taxes and other area taxes in a special district. Now, and then use tax increment financing. Now, in order to make that happen, they would actually have to reword the current legislation to allow that. And they would have to include legislation in tax increment financing so that special districts were specifically allowed to be the users of tax increment financing. Those are the two modifications that would have to happen for that to work. But if it does work, what happens is that, let's say the stadium is at $2 billion, right? Well, then the Washington football team has to pay a property tax. So you're collecting the property tax to be used for a bond issue to help pay for the stadium, right? So that really is what it seems all the parties want. A stadium facility and mixed-use development that actually pays for itself. But you get half that with the current structure, because as long as it's publicly owned by the government, I'm talking about the stadium, okay? You can't say, well, geez, you make a payment. Now, they could engineer some kind of deal where the Washington football team essentially pays a kind of fee, which is like a property tax, to the Virginia Stadium Authority, and basically solve it by that. But that would only be for the Washington football team. What you want is a structure that says, okay, all the private landholders within this area, including the Washington football team with a stadium, other developers that would build structures, they all pay the property tax, and that property tax goes to the stadium, the Virginia Football Stadium Authority, right? And that is used with tax increment financing to float a bond issue that then pays for construction. That revenue stream is far more robust and bigger than what is being proposed right now. The one that's being proposed right now is smaller, and once they run the numbers, it's not going to get the job done. They have a 40-year bond issue limit. All right, 40 years bond issue limit. So they've got some fixing to do with this revenue stream. Now, as far as my stance on government money used for facilities, let me tell you something. And I'm glad this facility is domed, because it's not a football stadium. It's now a large-scale event center. That's how Virginia should think of it, as a gigantic gathering place, even during disasters, where people can seek shelter. But in fun areas, people can go to enjoy terrific concerts and game-changing events, not just football. You could accommodate 200 different types of events in a facility like that. There are ample examples to buttress what I'm saying, including currently Allegiant Stadium and, of course, SoFi Stadium, the $5 billion wonder that Stan Kroenke built in LA. Now, point that I'm making is that if you would say, Zinni, a private activity bond doesn't allow use of, say, a 40-year, using it for a 40-year bond issue, my counter would be this. First of all, that's not exactly true. But I do believe there should be a review of federal legislation to make absolutely certain the language is tightened up so that no one can attack its use. There have been example after example after example of entertainment type of businesses, venues being used, being the focus of private activity bonds. It's not unusual. So my point is this: if you use private activity bonds, you then have a private really owned stadium, which then pays a property tax to the Virginia Football Stadium Authority, along with the other developments within that district. And the district should be of some size so that you can capture enough revenue from planned developments. I don't get the impression that where they want to build this, which hasn't been determined, has any existing structures. All right, they would be all new, and that's a better reason to start with the stadium. Okay, with the stadium. Alberto says they could build it at Ashburn, Loudoun County near their headquarters. Thanks, but that's a better reason to start with the stadium, because look, of all of the structures, it's not likely that you're going to get one that's of greater value than a $2 billion stadium. And that's where you want to start when you start calculating your base year assessed values, okay? Because let's say if I start with $2 billion right there off the top, and just the $2 billion, and I increase it by 4% per annum over a 45-year period, I know if the tax rate take is 1%, which I believe is greater in Virginia parlance, but I know that I'm going to get 1.6 billion. Okay, the numbers that I just recited to you, the reason why I know them so well is because I've done them with respect to the Oakland Athletics and Howard Terminal. I don't know how many times. I know it like the back of my hand, and I know this subject like the back of my hand. So I believe that rather than just using the cookie cutter approach and saying, we're just going to copy what was done in Las Vegas, I really believe that the Virginia Legislature needs to take a very serious look at a private activity bond option. I think that'll give more robust money for a subsidy, and it'll solve the riddle of how to make a private organization's structure pay for itself. All right. Subscribe. You have any questions? Please feel free. Hey, you can even text me here. That's the thing. Okay. And or you can that's that. Or you can email me right here. Okay. At Zenny62 Zenny62.com, excuse me, right here. If you have any questions, okay. So there you go. And this is the kind of thing I'm quite excited to stick my nose in, if you will. But to close, again, play this back for yourself. If you have any questions, please ask. Do not hesitate to ask. But I'm saying that right now, as it stands, both of these pieces of legislation that have been floated for the Virginia Legislature to consider and to vote on, SB 727 by Virginia Democratic Senator Richard Saslaw and House Bill 1315 by Virginia Senator Barry Knight, both want to accomplish one thing: the creation of the Virginia Football Stadium Authority, but also within it are poised to collect revenues, and in particular with SB 727 that points out tax, the collection of sales tax revenues that in total are not great enough, and they're not specific. Particularly House Bill 1353 isn't as specific as I would like. They mention, they kind of give you an opportunity to grab from any kind of combination you want to. But from a calculation standpoint, if you're saying, Zenny, develop a calculation based on that, I'm saying I need something concrete. Now, if you're saying for me to come up with the concrete one, I just did. And I basically said, I can do better with a type private activity bond model than with what's being proposed. The problem with the private activity bond model also happens to do with the amount of inventory private activity bonds that the state has approved for that year. So if what I believe should be sought is a kind of waiver, okay, so that they escape the normal clutches of the idea that, well, we've got all these private activity bonds, we can't do another one, because that would be a deal killer right there. Okay, so that needs to be that circle needs to be squared. But I can tell you, as it is right now, what is being proposed is not going to make enough stadium subsidy money to satisfy the needs of the Washington football team for financing or the National Football League. And it'll be so low that they might as well consider a private option. And if they're going to subsidize, they might as well design it so the subsidy goes to a private organization, to a private activity bond. And you would say, well, Zenny, what happens if the bond goes default? Yeah, great question. What happens is basically this. The contract will be designed so that the Virginia Football Stadium Authority will wind up owning the facility. Okay? Because in a private activity example, the Washington football team owns the facility and gets the revenue. All right. But what you're doing here, okay, so there's also another option of industrial development bonds, except that they have a 20-year limit, which should be removed. There should not be a limit on industrial development revenue bonds. If there were not, I would offer that as another example. That piece of legislation should be done too at the federal level to get rid of that. We need more fiscal flexibility for large projects to be able to pay for themselves. Having a limit like that is absolutely ridiculous. All right. Subscribe to Zenny62 and bookmark oaklandnewsnow.com, and that ends this broadcast. Thank you.